Hi, I'm Linda Naranjo Huebl, and I am a professor of gender studies and English at Calvin University. And I want to share my thoughts on a couple specific areas of the Human Sexuality Report. I confess a reluctance to engage in depth with the report because as a teacher of research methods, the committee's mandate itself violates the condition of what I would consider reliable or principled scholarship. Nevertheless, I will look at a couple of areas that intersect with my own. I am going to use a PowerPoint here to help keep me on track. First of all, I'm going to look at gender variance and then disability theology. Here are my definitions. As you can see, the gender variance, it's a wide category, but I'm going to look specifically at intersex and transgender. And disability theology, which is missing from the report, and I hope to share its importance. The report is premised on the notion that sex and gender are dichotomous and that scripture dictates roles and behavior of men and women, but it raises questions. What defines male and female sexual behavior and attraction? And what are your sources? According to what? Scripture, science, culture, history, society, law, which, by the way, all have definitions that have changed over time. I would argue that gender variance is a direct challenge to the foundational premise of the report. There is some scholarly consensus, first, that sex, sexuality, and gender identity exist on a spectrum. I can honestly say I know of no reputable scholars who argue differently. They agree that definitions of male and sex and gender and associated roles have differed across time and across cultures. They agree that there's no single determinants of sex, gender identity, or orientation, and they agree that attraction is a natural biological and psychological process. Regarding transgender persons, I refer people to Professor Helder's critique and the misrepresentation of the science in that area in the report. But I want to make a comment about Appendix A, which is a critique of brain organization theory. I'm not at all sure of the relevance here. The appendix doesn't explain it, and it doesn't provide any sources on brain organization theory. My assumption is that because some brain organization theorists argue for the etiology of, biological etiology of homosexuality and transgender, that they felt it important to offer a critique. But also interestingly, there are opponents or there are those who refute brain organization theory and argue instead that our brains are mosaics of gender characteristics. I want to look at its discussion of intersex persons, which they refer to intersex as disorders of sexual development. In fact, they point to that terminology because the terminology itself says these are disorders. This is the medical terminology of 20th century medical research, but that nomenclature is changing. In fact, the citation they offer for this terminology, I have brought up their link in footnote 113. And as you can see here, they acknowledge this change in terminology, disorder/differences of sex development. This changing terminology has come about as a result of intersex persons arguing that they do not have a disorder, they are merely different. Their discussion results in some contradictions because I think different people did different parts of the report. But on page 72, they argue persons with a DSD do not constitute a third sex. But their Appendix B, which is an impressive and prolonged delineation of the multiple variations of sex development, suggests that there's a third sex, fourth sex, fifth sex, sixth, and so on. So strange contradiction there. The term third sex historically has referred to the cultural spaces made for gender variant persons. And here's some terminology from different cultures. There's many more. They also argue in their discussion of Matthew 19, this is where Jesus talks about 3 different kinds of eunuchs, and the category where Jesus says some are born that way. They argue that it references infertility or impotence, not intersexuality. Interestingly, though, the definition of DSDs, many of which go undiagnosed, include conditions that cause infertility and sexual dysfunction. In fact, their appendix points out that 1 to 3% of the population has intersex conditions, whether they recognize it or not. The report implies that people with these conditions are mandated to remain celibate. But ironically, think 1 to 3%. There's people in our pews, there's people in every church that have these conditions, many of whom are happily married. They also, I believe, misrepresent the work of Megan DeFranza. They quote her on the difficulty of defining what Jesus meant by this category of eunuchs in Matthew 19, but they completely ignore the conclusion of her extensive research, which is that gender variance is a creational variation, not a disorder resulting from the fall. The report also omits the work of many impressive Christian scholars in this area. Susan Cornwall, I want to mention because she has interviewed hundreds of intersex and transgender Christians and she's a prolific publisher, as are the rest of the people in this list, and their work is not cited at all. I want to shift subjects to another one, the question of whether gender variance is a result of the fall or whether in fact it's a creational variant. There are 57 references to gender variance in as a disorder, as a birth defect. But the report never answers the question of what constitutes a disorder resulting from the fall. There's no engagement with people categorized this way. They never ask the question of the possibility of emotional and spiritual damage to people who are being classified this way. And importantly, while they consider it a disability, there's no engagement with disability theologians. This is a very rich field, and these individuals here have so much to say to contribute to this discussion, and their voices are not heard in this report either. So this leaves us with some questions raised. What if one's, quote, disability is central to their identity? What if the label itself causes serious psychological and spiritual damage? What if one's suffering is actually a result of societal labels and stigmas and persecution rather than any kind of defect? What if a person feels deeply blessed in their identity? What if they want to celebrate how they are fearfully and wonderfully made? So what are the implications in terms of this discussion? If sex, sexuality, and gender identity exist on a spectrum, then the premise of the report is undermined from the beginning. If gender variance has been acknowledged over time in cultures and differently, then we have to consider the cultural context of the Bible writers. What do we do if no scriptural or scientific definitions of male and female can really be nailed down? What if gender variance is a creational variant and not a disorder? How do we make moral judgments? How do we tell people what they are mandated to do with their life if we do not engage with them and hear their voices? Well, Jesus gave us a paradigm for that. He tells us a tree is known by its fruit. But if we are not in conversation, if we are not in relationship, then how can we possibly bear witness to fruit? Thank you for your time.